Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the civil seminar this week. So today we are very pleased to have Dr. Jason Leach with us. Jason is a forest hydrologist and works with the Canadian Forest Service at the Great Lakes Forestry Center in Sault Ste. Marie. Jason has received his PhD at the University of British Columbia, and prior to joining the Forest Service, he was an assistant prof at the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University. So he is quite experienced in hydrologic projects related to basically to understand how streams and their forested watersheds respond to environment changes, the effects of harvesting, wildfire, climate change, land cover change, etc. on the streams, water quality as well as the quantity of the flows. He has worked in projects in Canada, USA, and Sweden, and today he's going to present stream temperature response to forest harvesting, the influence of small lakes. Thank you again, Jason, for accepting our invitation, and please share your screen whenever you're ready. Thanks.
All right, you can hear me all right and everything looks good? Great, awesome. Thank you so much, Reza, for the introduction and whatnot, and it's great to have an opportunity to speak with you all today. I was looking at the civil seminar series, and it looks like quite an eclectic mix of topics, which is really great, and great to be exposed to various things. I don't think I've been in the same sort of seminar series as the details on concrete and footbridges and wind hazards and everything like that. So this is kind of a nice opportunity here to share some of this work with a different audience. So that's great. Yeah, so as Reza mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some work looking at stream temperature response to forest harvesting and the influence of small lakes. There we go. Okay. So before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge a few of my co-authors or colleagues on this work. I have a couple folks from the, I'm getting polled about something, but there we go.
Yeah,
yeah, sure. A couple colleagues actually from an engineering department at Utah State, Bethany Nelson and Caleb Buahan, as well as some forest hydrology folks, Dan Moore at UBC and Hjalmar Loudon at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, which has a forestry program as well. I thought maybe I'd give you a tiny little bit of context to, as Reza mentioned, I work for the Canadian Forest Service, and I'm guessing probably a lot of you have no idea that Canada has a Forest Service or what they do. Canada is kind of an interesting situation. The federal government doesn't really own or directly manage too much forested lands in Canada. Most of that is obviously operated or managed by the provinces, with the exception of national parks. So the Canadian Forest Service, our primary mandate here is to really provide scientific research to inform sustainable forest management. And a little bit of context, we have 5 main offices, research offices scattered across the province, one in Victoria, Edmonton, one in Sault Ste. Marie, where I'm located at the Great Lakes Forestry Center, one in Quebec, and then a split office in Atlantic Canada between Corner Brook and Fredericton. We also have some folks at our headquarters in Ottawa. And to give you sort of a flavor of what the Canadian Forest Service does in sort of a broader context, is, as you can see here, this is sort of our main, what we call programs that people within the CFS work on. And so there's, it really runs the gamut from sort of more economically driven efforts, such as the forest sector competitiveness program, to, and pardon the pun, hot topics like wildfire risk, which obviously gets in the news quite a bit. It's quite an active research program and operational program around wildfire concerns. Areas that I sort of sit in are obviously things like sustainable forest management, forest climate change, and this sort of nebulous term cumulative effects, where really sort of, as you can imagine, water threads its way through a lot of these topics, and hence why we conduct research in forest hydrology. So to provide some of that context, really the sort of motivation for a lot of my work is forests are changing, and they're changing through a variety of different pressures and stressors. Obviously, climate change is a big one, and how forests are constantly changing through that mechanism. Forest harvesting, which I'll just discuss today as well. But then we also have things like insect outbreaks. For example, mountain pine beetle in Western Canada over the last decade or two has caused massive change in the forest structure and whatnot in that parts of the country. And you can imagine too, invasive species such as emerald ash borer and other sort of pests like that, or insects like that, can also alter the forest structure in a variety of ways. And then, of course, wildfire is another big one. And so what I'm really interested in is how these forest change interact with water, with the hydrologic cycle and eco-hydrological processes that occur in forested landscapes within the context of the implications for sort of our forest ecosystem products and services. So this could be things like downstream flooding risk due to changes in forest structure and the hydrology of the watershed. This could also be looking at aquatic habitat, which will be a focus today. Another big area that we conduct a lot of research on is the impacts of forest change on drinking water supply and natural infrastructure for running our provision of good quality drinking water. So from a forest management side of things, the main paradigm to try to protect some of these ecosystem services from forest management, from forest operation, is this whole idea of sensitivity mapping. And the idea here is that if we can map out where in the landscape, the forested landscape, where we may see the most sensitivity to change, in this case forest harvesting, if we try not to operate or do those sorts of activities in those areas, then the idea is that we will sustain the ecosystem products and services functions that we depend on, or aquatic ecosystems depend on. So this is a very classic example here. This is from the Ontario Ministry Stand and Site Guide that sort of dictates how forest operations should be conducted in Ontario. And a very sort of classic approach is to identify things like lakes and streams and ponds and designate them as either being highly sensitive to alteration, or moderate sensitivity or low sensitivity, and according to that, leave things like riparian buffers, or don't do operations close to those water bodies. So that's really the paradigm that we work with. And to give you a little bit of a sense of sort of some of the details behind that, is we classify, or the province classifies, highly sensitive potential locations as things like all rivers, and they define rivers here as greater than catchment area of greater than 50 square kilometers. Also, depending if there's been any inventory data indicating that brook trout or other species at risk are found in some of these water bodies, that will sort of trigger, again, a designation of a high sensitivity potential. Along those lines, any mapped stream segments, these typically based on our sort of digital elevation models and how these maps generally have catchment areas greater than 3 square kilometers. So obviously I put in italics here, mapped, because as we know, our ability to map some of these don't really replicate what we see in the actual landscape. And then finally, any streams and stream segments that are within 500 meters of a lake. And again, a lake here is designated anything larger than 8 hectares, or flowing into a river or connected to a river. If it falls into this, then it's subject to certain types of harvest protection. And mostly what that means is if there's a forest, an intact forest on both sides of that water body, then the harvesting rules are such that at least one side of that stream or river has to retain unharvested residual, what we call residual forest, within sort of 10, 15 meters of the stream. And the idea here is primarily to provide shade for the stream, but there's other sort of purposes as well, to sort of minimize soil disturbance and potential sediment getting into the stream system and whatnot. Now, as you can imagine, what I hope you're sort of thinking through as you go through this, well, geez, this is, I think this might be missing things, or how good is this, or what, how comprehensive is this? So, for example, what about all those unmapped stream segments out there? What happens to those? What about lakes that are smaller than a surface area of 8 hectares, or watersheds that are smaller than 50 square kilometers? What happens in these situations? And this is exactly where some of this research goes into, is we don't know when we're trying to improve our understanding of how sensitive these systems actually are. So as I mentioned on the top, a big focus here is on stream temperature. And the reason we sort of view stream temperature as a pretty critical thing to look at is that it's generally sort of considered the master variable of aquatic ecosystems. As you can imagine, it controls a whole slew of biological, chemical, and physical processes occurring in that stream environment. And from a regulatory standpoint, probably the biggest issue has to do with cold water fish habitat. So in Ontario, brook trout is a major sort of species of concern, and they prefer and to thrive in cold water streams, cold habitats. As Reza mentioned, I worked in BC for a long time, and there it's a very big topic is forestry operations and the impact on stream thermal regimes, because salmon are such an economical and culturally important fish species there, and there are a lot of those populations declining in part due to warming surface waters. So in BC and Ontario, for example, there are these regulations that are aimed to prevent or mitigate changes to the stream temperature regime due to forest harvesting. And what I have here on the right is a little diagram showing the various energy exchanges that drive our observed stream temperature. So very much from a sort of physical perspective, the various energy exchanges that do this. And so for some of you that may have a bit of a background in this, a lot of this will look familiar, but we have things like the energy exchanges occurring at the stream surface, specifically incoming solar radiation, long wave radiation exchange, and the turbulent energy exchange, the latent heat flux. At the stream bed, we have other energy exchanges occurring, so bed heat conduction, hydraulic exchange, lateral advection associated with hill slope runoff or groundwater inputs. And so the whole idea here is that forest harvesting will go in and obviously alter primarily the riparian structure and have consequences for the stream temperature. So the most obvious sort of being that you remove the riparian vegetation, you have increased solar radiation, and you have the potential to warm that stream. And that's what we tend to see. So there's been decades now of a lot of research looking at stream temperature response to forest harvesting. And in terms of summer response, which is usually a big focus because that's when we start reaching temperatures that reach the upper lethal limits of cold water fish, we've seen a real wide range of responses observed in the literature from these empirical studies, anywhere from -2 degrees to 12 degrees increase. And that really depends on the location, where geographically you are, but also the harvesting treatment. So was harvesting done right up to the stream edge, or in this case, was there a riparian buffer that remained? And you're probably thinking -2 degrees. That doesn't really sort of fit with our sort of understanding of sort of energy exchange physics. If you imagine you increase the amount of incoming solar radiation, you probably should expect to see an increase. This sort of case tends to happen when we're talking about small streams and there's a lot of harvesting debris or leftover trees that fall over the stream surface and end up providing really effective shade. Maybe a lot of other sort of arguments for maybe not the best sort of situation to impact the stream environment, but that gives you a sense that sometimes we see these counterintuitive responses in sort of studies. So a question that gets begged a little bit is, particularly in northern landscapes, so a lot of Canada and the Canadian Shield or whatnot, we have a lot of these small headwater lakes that tend to not sort of be, for example, recognized in our sensitivity mapping, but they're everywhere. They're all over the place. And I've had the fortune of working with Reza over the last year and a half with a master's student, Vahid, who's from a hydrological standpoint has sort of, some of his work is suggesting that, geez, these small lakes are also really important for stream flow. We suspect that they may also be important for influencing how a stream responds to forest harvesting. And some of these ideas come from a paper from getting on a while now, about 15 years ago, where they did a study where they had looked at 3 small lakes and the streams draining them. 2 of these lakes, or 2 of these streams, had some harvesting done along the stream edge, indicated here and here. And there was 1 stream and lake system that was left over as a control. And what they measured stream temperature at the upstream and downstream locations above and below the harvesting blocks. And what they found was, it seemed like the lakes maybe moderated the temperature response to harvesting. Now, there's some limitations to that study, and so they were only able to sort of suggest that that might have been the case. And so what we're going to do in this study is sort of explore that hypothesis in a little bit more depth. And sort of give you some context for this, there's a number of sort of experimental designs, right, that we can use to look at these sorts of experiments or look at these sorts of questions. And so you can look at sort of a before-after situation where if you look at here, let's take the solid line, you measure the system before harvesting or some sort of change occurs, and then you measure the system after. Now, obviously, a major limitation of that is attributing that change to the harvesting. So for example, maybe you're shifting some sort of climate mode, or there's something else going on that's confounding that sort of relationship. Oftentimes, particularly for certain studies, like let's say looking at wildfire, you're limited to what's called a control impact study, where you can't look at the before situation, so you're really limited at the after situation. So you might go out and measure a stream that was harvested and a stream that was unharvested, and compare the differences. Now, obviously, an issue with this is that there is natural variability between let's say watersheds or streams or the different systems that you're looking at. And so being able, again, to attribute the difference between these two may be confounded by other factors. And then sort of the gold standard for a lot of this sort of what we call paired catchment studies or these approaches, what's called before-after controlled impact study, or a BACI design. And this is where you measure both your treatment watershed and your control watershed or your reference watershed before that agent of change, that harvesting or wildfire occurs, to get some sort of relationship, build that, have the impact, the treatment effect, and then continue to monitor both those systems into the future as well. And the idea here is that you control for natural variability, you can control for variability through time, and isolate the impact of that treatment. Another opportunity or another method that's been proposed or gets used a bit is what's called virtual experiments. This is using computer models to simulate different scenarios to also assess things. A very handy approach during COVID when you're not allowed to really go out and do field work. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is a virtual experiment to explore this hypothesis about headwater lakes and their influences on downstream temperature. So what we have here is I'm introducing you here the prototype catchments for this virtual experiment. So this is using data from a study site in northern Sweden, so a boreal forest, very similar to kind of climate that we see in a lot of northern Canada. with some key differences as well. And where am I physically located? Well, I'm somewhere else in Canada right now. But so anyway, so here's our key study sites. And so we've got a small lake here with a surface area about 4 hectares in size, and then a stream that's draining this. Stream's about 1.5 kilometers. And we measured a number of hydrology and stream temperature variables along this, and microclimate variables. As you can see, stream discharge, hydrometric station at the sort of top of the stream segment at the bottom. So a couple weather stations to characterize the above stream microclimate, subsurface temperatures to measure the temperature of the groundwater inflow or the lateral inflow, and then a number of stream temperatures as well. There was also some hemispherical photos taken to characterize the riparian canopy and estimate the net radiation occurring along the stream as well. And so we had this sort of situation, but we wanted to compare this to a site without a lake. And that's what we used this site here, this nearby site here, which is entirely forested, and quite handily has about a very similar catchment area as the catchment area draining into C5, so this upper portion here. So the whole idea was to essentially, within a modeling environment, take this C1 catchment and stick it on the top of this watershed, remove the lake, and have water, essentially, and the temperature of that water draining out of C1 come into this stream reach. And so that's really the experimental design. And to show you in a different way, what we have here is the real watershed, which has a headwater lake, and then a simulated watershed that has a headwater lake. And we've got our upstream discharge boundary and our lower stream downstream discharge boundary, and then simulate harvest in this lower section or in this in the stream reach. So the key thing here is that we've got different boundary conditions coming into that stream reach. And then to conduct this sort of virtual experiment, we use we've used a process-based stream temperature model, and this is a model as mentioned, developed by Bethany Nelson and Caleb Buahen at Utah State. It's called HydroCouple. As I mentioned, it's a sort of physically based, process-based stream temperature model. And there's a diagram here that sort of highlights the various energy exchanges that it accounts for. The nice thing is that and what we need is it accounts for the role of riparian vegetation. And it's been fairly comprehensively evaluated at the test catchment that I've been showing you, the C5, C6 reach. And I'll just show you a little example of some of the temperature dynamics we see at this reach. Hopefully this comes through with you okay. This is a little video using what's called distributed temperature sensing technology. So this is essentially a fiber optic cable that was about 1.5 kilometers long that was laid down in the stream. And what happens is you send laser pulses down this, and based on the temperature of the cable and the backscattering of that signal, you can calculate or back calculate out what the temperature is along that cable at about every 25 centimeters every 6 minutes. So you end up painting a really comprehensive picture of the thermal regime at high resolution of that stream. And so what this is just showing an example of these data along the stream reach. So this is the lake outlet down to the bottom of that main study reach through a rainfall event. So we've got sort of base flow conditions here. We've got a couple rainstorms coming through. We see our peak flow response and then into the recession limb. And as this circles back, I'll just sort of highlight a couple of things to take out of this. Is first of all, you have warm water coming out of the lake. And then what you can see here is that there's a couple of key groundwater inputs, as indicated here by the gray bands, that are main inputs of relatively cold water. And so you get this interesting step shape. As you move through the rain event and now into the recession limb, a lot of that stream water is primarily sourced from the lake. And so hence why you lose that sort of groundwater signal that you're seeing there, and you get a relatively, flat line, more or less, in terms of the thermal regime. So we use this data to test the model in a number of ways, both of its ability to recreate some of these dynamics, as well as predict downstream temperatures. And that's what I'll show you in the next graph, is an example of the downstream temperature predictions for the stream reach. And so in black is observed. This is going from a period in July into the fall. And red is our model, and there's a bit of a range there to account for some uncertainty in some of the parameters. And what we see is, for the most part, we're doing a relatively good job of predicting stream temperature here. This is hourly stream temperature, just for context. There are clearly some periods where we're over-predicting by a little bit, some other periods where we're under-predicting. But for the most part, and definitely compared to a lot of other sort of approaches or examples of this sort of prediction, we're doing a fairly good job of predicting the downstream temperature, again, suggesting that we're doing an okay job of representing the various energy fluxes acting on that stream reach. And so in doing this virtual experiment, we're making some key assumptions. So as I mentioned, we're assuming the current model captures the key energy exchange processes. Like I said, there's a lot of evaluation that goes into that, and don't have a ton of time to get into that here, but I hopefully I gave you a couple examples of why we have some confidence in that occurring with this model. The other thing here is that we're for the no lake scenario, we're using data from that adjacent catchment. Now, although the catchment areas are relatively similar, the stream flow, the measured stream flow at those two watersheds are a little bit different. So what we did is adjusted made a correction to that stream flow so that they have the equal volume of water moving through that stream section. The key thing is that there'll be a difference in timing of that volume, and we wanted to do that in order to just control for that as a confounding influence. Now, we did some sensitivity analysis to see how much of an effect that makes, and given the type of adjustment we needed to make, it doesn't have that big of an effect, so that's okay. And as I mentioned, we don't adjust the stream temperature because that's really what we want to get. We want to get a no lake stream temperature as a comparison. The other thing that we assume is that we have some meteorological data measured from an open site that we use as a surrogate for post-harvesting microclimate above the stream. And so what we're assuming there is that the following stream side harvesting, we have an increase in solar radiation, an increase in daytime air temperature, and an increase in wind speed. In contrast, we would expect to see a nighttime air temperature and relative humidity to decrease. And that's simply because you're getting more air movement through there, at least in terms of the relative humidity. And you're going to get less long-wave radiation from the canopy controlling that air temperature during the nighttime. And finally, we're also assuming that there's the vegetation understory or regrowth provides minimal shade. So we're assuming that when we go in and harvest, we're removing all the key vegetation that's providing shade. So here's give you a context or to highlight what the upstream conditions are before the water enters the harvesting reach, both for the no lake and the lake situation. So again, we're really focused on this sort of July, so going through peak of summer into fall period. In the top graph here, we have the upper boundary discharge in liters per second. In red, we have the no lake, and in blue, we have the lake scenario. And I think the key thing to draw from this is obviously the influence of the lake on the hydrology, right? The lake dampens or moderates those peak flow responses, and then it augments base flow compared to the no lake scenario, which is much more flashy, and we see these sort of lower base flow conditions. In terms of the upper boundary temperature, we see a very distinct signal from these two systems. Obviously, the lake is much warmer, and you can imagine that lake is acting like a big solar panel, so it's so that water is able to warm up quite a bit before it discharges down into the stream reach, compared to the no lake scenario where we've got a lot more we've got a smaller water surface. It's just a stream. And there's a lot of riparian shading or vegetation here. And so we have a temperature difference of, in some cases, almost close to 10 degrees Celsius between these two as they move into the harvesting reach. So we take these two different inputs and we plug it into the stream temperature model for the harvesting segment, and then we run a couple different scenarios. One, an unharvested scenario using the existing sort of riparian vegetation and whatnot, and then one scenario where we assume the stream side harvest, where we remove the riparian vegetation. So what we see here is the lake scenario in the top graph. So we've got the unharvested in black and the harvesting situation in red, and the no lake scenario below here. Again, using this color scheme. And the key thing here is that obviously following harvesting, you see a temperature increase. Again, this is hourly data, a temperature increase, particularly during the sort of peak summer periods. That's a little bit less or more moderate as you go into the fall period. And the same sort of thing for the no lake. Now, it's really hard to sort of compare these two and say, well, the no lake is higher than the lake, or the lake is higher than the no lake. So in the next couple of graphs, we'll make that sort of direct comparison so that you can see those differences. But for now, just sort of sharing or stepping through this and seeing the different responses. I think the other interesting thing is we can look at the longitudinal response. So this is the distance downstream of the lake or the upper portion of the reach. And this is for a midday period. So this is taken for one day, sort of in the middle of the summer during about 12 or 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a little snapshot in time. And what we see here is we can take the lake scenario first. In the blue, we have the unharvested scenario. And in the red, we have the clear cut or the harvested scenario. So the key thing here is that we see in the unharvested, we see a decrease in temperature as you move from the lake outlet downstream, punctuated by these key groundwater input locations. When we harvest that, we see obviously a temperature increase. We still see that effect of the groundwater inputs, but I think a key thing here is that overall we're still seeing cooling. So I think this highlights limitations of sort of a post going out there and doing a sort of, for example, like a control impact study, right? Where if you were to just measure at the top of the harvesting reach and the bottom of the harvesting reach, you'd conclude, well, geez, the stream didn't warm along this reach. Therefore, there was no effect from the harvesting, which would obviously be an incorrect interpretation of these data. You compare it to the no lake scenario where we've got in the unharvested situation, we still have some stream cooling going on along this stream reach. But when we get into the clear cut, again, we see an increase in that temperature. And then we're also seeing a general increase from the top of the reach, the bottom of the reach, again, punctuated by these groundwater inflows causing some localized cooling. So let's compare this relative temperature response. So this is the both the lake and no lake harvesting scenario compared to its respective unharvested scenario. So this is relative to its own baseline conditions. This is hourly data, so this is a little bit messy, but I wanted to show this at least to sort of highlight some of the diurnal signals. So clearly the lake scenario tends to have lower nighttime responses than the no lake scenario. In contrast, and it's a little bit hard to see, but the no lake scenario seems to have greater maximum responses than the lake scenario. We can show this aggregated over a daily time step, which is maybe a little bit sort of cleaner to see some of the signals. For the most part, what we're seeing here is that the no lake scenario is a bit more responsive to the forced harvesting than the lake scenario. And we can look at this in a little bit more context and sort of, as in looking at this graph, we can see that varies through time, right? There's times where it's quite clearly the temperature response is less or more moderated for the lake site than the no lake site, but there's other periods here where there's not much difference. And so the good question becomes, what's controlling that variability through time? And so what I have here, and this is take a minute here to sort of walk you through what's being shown in this graph. The top panel here is the difference between the no lake response and the lake response. So, and this is at the hourly time step. So this is really just the difference between these two signals here. And so there are zero value here. And so when this line plots above that zero line, then the no lake response is greater. The no lake temperature response harvest is greater. When the line plots below that dotted line, then the lake response is greater. And so what we see here for the most part, during most of the period, the no lake response is greater, from about a half a degree to a degree, into a little bit more. But there are these times where we see that the lake response is actually greater than the no lake response. And part of that has to do with the hydrology of the system. And that's what we see here at the bottom graph. And this is the discharge at the downstream location of the no lake scenario and the minus the lake scenario. So we interpret this the same way. When the line is above 0, then the flow in the no lake scenario is greater. And when the line plots below that, the solid line plots below the 0 value, the flow in the lake watershed or the lake scenario is greater. And so what we see here is the function of sort of that base flow augmentation, right, by the lake, where for a lot of this period, especially during low flows or moderate flows, there's more water in that stream system because of that lake discharging water downstream at a sort of an attenuated signal kind of thing. Except for during high runoff periods when we have the no lake flow is much greater, and that happens to correspond with when we see less of a difference, or in some cases that lake response being greater. So I think the key thing to draw from this is clearly the hydrology has a lot to do with that temperature response and what's going on. Another part of this is because we are using this process stream temperature model, we can interrogate the various energy fluxes to identify what else is going on within the internal mechanisms of these two scenarios. And so, as I mentioned, we've got the various energy fluxes here that I showed earlier, and we can extract these from the graph. So this is a bit of a busy graph. What we have here is the various energy fluxes that I have listed there. So bed conduction, latent heat flux, the heat addition due to the friction, the sensible heat flux, the hyperetic exchange, the outgoing long wave radiation for both the lake scenario and the no lake scenario. So these fluxes are all in watts per meter squared. And the key thing here is that, or one of the conventions in the stream temperature literature is that if it's positive, it's a net input to the stream environment, and if it's a negative value, then it's an outward flux, or it's a flux of energy away from the stream environment. And so what you can see here is some of the fluxes are relatively similar between the two cases. So bed heat conduction, the hyperetic exchange, there's no real strong difference between the two. There is some difference in the friction, the heat added due to friction, but it's such a low magnitude input that, at least compared to the energy fluxes, that it's not that important. The key ones that do pop out, though, here is obviously the outgoing long wave radiation, and to a lesser extent, the sensible latent heat fluxes. And what this is due to is the fact that you have warmer water coming out of that lake, which is altering or compared to the no lake scenario, which is creating conditions for greater outgoing long wave radiation, a greater cooling effect from latent and sensible heat exchange for part of that time. So not only is the hydrology important, but the temperature signal that the lake causes also has some implications for the temperature response, how that stream responds. So in wrapping up, a few key conclusions from this is this virtual experiment seems to confirm or highlight that lakes do appear to moderate downstream temperature response. And as I've sort of highlighted, the lakes store and delay runoff from rain events and augment base flow, as well as have elevated outflow temperatures. And it's the combination of these influences of the lake that are really driving that moderating response. And then finally, I think what this work does is maybe lets us rethink a little bit about what surface water features might be most sensitive to forest operations. And the idea here being that potentially streams draining lakes, at least if we're thinking of their temperature, may be a bit less sensitive to streamside harvesting and forest operations than watersheds out there that don't have these sort of headwater lakes, or don't have these lakes draining the streams, or the streams draining these lakes. And so we continue to sort of work on some of this stuff. As I mentioned, sort of Vahid's been doing some work from a hydrologic standpoint, looking at the role of lakes at larger spatial scales. And we're also doing some empirical work looking at also understanding lake networks, particularly chain of lakes, and whether you can imagine is 5 small lakes equivalent to 1 large lake in terms of how they process disturbances in the landscape and things like that. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting questions with practical implications for how we design forest operations and forest management by looking at the role of lakes, especially in these sort of environments where there's a lot of them. And as I mentioned, this was a virtual experiment. So it's great. It's a great way to start thinking about these systems and trying to understand them. But we also want to go out and do some field-based studies to sort of test some of the assumptions that I listed about stream network sensitivity and whatnot. So we have some efforts ongoing on that that are obviously sort of struggle to do right now because of some of the COVID restrictions and things. But that's also where we're going with stuff. And I believe that's it. And I will end there. And hopefully Rez didn't fall asleep. It's late where he is, so and maybe late where others are as well. But thank you a lot for your time and listen to me blab on about this sort of stuff. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Jason. Very, very interesting presentation, and interesting to learn about the effects of the lakes on the streams and stream temperature. So I ask everyone to either ask your questions through the chat window box, or just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your questions if you have any. In the meantime, I want to take another attendance. So I do have one question. So Jason, how about the effects of the topography, the changes in the slope of the river, if it's a very steep river system or flat system, and the length of the river? How do you think those will play?
Yeah, no, that's a great point there, Reza. And so, so as you can imagine, and I think where your sort of question's leading, obviously, is when we sort of go in and we harvest these sort of chunks, we're creating these sort of canopy openings, right? And a big question is, or a big function of the potential for heating is how long those water parcels reside in that opening. So what I would expect is if you've got sort of a high gradient stream where high velocity, where water's moving through that system a lot faster, then as that water moves downstream, it's going to spend less time in the canopy opening and have less time being influenced by the increased solar radiation, for example, and the other microclimate conditions. So that would be that's what I would sort of expect in that thing versus a low gradient stream where those water velocities are much lower. And I apologize, I think there was a second part to that question.
No, I think you touched on that, both the length and the slope.
Oh, the length, yeah. And so absolutely, so that's a really good point as well. And again, all things being equal, you have a larger section of harvested opening, you just have a greater potential for stream warming. Now there's going to be sort of an upper limit to that where the energy balance is going to be such where the stream's warmed as much as it can warm given the microclimate conditions and whatnot, and then you have that. But a lot of this is really focused on generally headwater streams or smaller forested stream networks, and so the temperature, except when you have a lake there, the temperature tends to be starting at a relatively cool temperature because it's generally groundwater source. So the warming potential is a lot higher. But as I mentioned, or as I hope this sort of talk highlights, it's a different story when you start water sourced from these lakes and pond complexes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. A question from Yi. And I want to generalize that as well. Does the climate change affect the number of lakes and size of the lakes? And I think now with this lot of investigations on the effects of climate change, now you have changes in temperature, but how precipitation regime will change, how that will affect the evaporation, snow melt, all these. Based on your, I'm sure you have maybe worked on these, topics or have reviewed papers related to that. But what is the current understanding of the effects of climate change on these kind of systems, lake stream systems, especially with respect to the temperature in Canada?
Yeah, no, that's a great question from both of you in that way. So the short answer is to the climate change effect on the number of lakes and sizes of lakes. Good question. I'm not entirely sure. I suspect that that is really going to depend a lot on the timing and the sequencing of what climate change looks like, kind of thing. And then, I mean, Reza's Reza knows this stuff a lot better than I do, kind of thing. But essentially these lakes are, they're storage features in the landscape, and so they can, to some extent, sort of buffer variability because they're storing water. They can buffer some variability in climate change, but you can imagine that if you've got greater sort of potential evapotranspiration, you've got less rainfall. Then yeah, you're probably going to see, especially some of these smaller lakes that don't have a lot of storage capacity, you're going to see them sort of shrink or disappear. I mean, it gets really complicated because I think a lot of these also are connected to the groundwater system. So then there's that sort of legacy, that lag effect, right? If it's still being fed by a groundwater system, then yeah, you'll likely see a climate change impact, but that might be lagged over time, kind of. That's going to be a lot more lagged and not as immediate. So short answer is I don't know. Long answer is pretty fascinating, and I think it's a really interesting question. And then your point there, Reza, on the climate change and stream temperature of these sorts of lake stream networks. Yeah, there's a ton on this sort of stuff. I've done a lot on sort of stream temperature and climate change impacts on stream temperature. And again, it's a really fascinating question for the exact things that you talk about, things like timing and magnitude of snow melt and the snow signal into summer, the low flow periods and the precipitation events and all these sorts of things. I think the one thing I would say is that for a lot of, in a lot of sort of stream temperature contexts, the main driver of stream warming is solar radiation. So, and not really air temperature. And so solar radiation, by and large, isn't going to vary too much. Obviously, things like cloud condition and what are, that's going to influence that. But I think the really fascinating side of all this discussion is the hydrology of these systems, because it is so tightly coupled in terms of the thermal regimes. It's not just the surface energy fluxes; it's also the hydrology of the system. And so that's why work like that you do, Reza, and others, looking at sort of the hydrologic response to climate change, has a lot of implications for, I think, a lot of these sort of water quality concerns as well, including stream temperature. So yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Question from Benjamin. Do you consider any other effects that logging has on streams, e.g. erosion, increase in total suspended solid? Is that correct?
Sediment, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question there, Benjamin. And absolutely, my personal research hasn't done a ton into that field, but there's a quite extensive amount of work from colleagues and other folks looking at forest hydrology that have focused on those questions. And in some landscapes, that can be an absolutely critical issue and of really high importance, particularly around not so much the forest harvesting itself, but the building and installation of forest access roads and roads, and particularly stream crossing, where those roads cross streams. And there's quite a bit of research and ongoing research looking at some of those questions.
Great. Yeah, very interesting. I think this is an area that requires a lot of research, and thanks to your efforts and your team's efforts, we'll have a better.
Sorry, I just see a hand up from Clara, I think. I don't know.
I didn't see that. Go ahead, Clara.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you, Jason, for a wonderful presentation. My question is on flow initiations. So with the climate change, so how responsive is, or how critical is temperature to flow initiations on the current relief features, mostly the existing water bodies, and the impact to the forestry applications or operations, as well as other applications? So that was my question.
Oh, okay, sure. Claire, would you mind just sort of expanding a little bit what you mean by flow initiations? I'm not sure if I fully understand what you mean by that. It might just be a discipline difference. But,
yes. Maybe I'm not going to be as correct, but close. What I understand is the amount of water, the hydraulic analysis of the amount of water in a specific with a specific like size. So when you're doing the hydraulic analysis, like in the GIS, and it's most of the time real time. So you can analyze from the very dry season to the very wet season.
Okay.
So the impact, yeah. So the impact of so is the temperature. How critical is the temperature to those flow initiations? So you can play around on how much the coverage the water would be on. I don't know how to explain it, but I think you get the point.
I think I do. Yeah, and I think these sort of flow initiation points on the landscape. So when sort of subsurface water transitions into the surface water network, is that sort of what you're thinking there?
Yes, and you can regulate maybe at example maybe 20 meters square, 400 meters square, like in terms of area when you do the hydrolysis. This example.
Yeah, it depends on the landscape. And, exactly. So that's no, interesting question. That's a really interesting question, and I think I'm not sure how much the temperature or at least the water temperature impacts that. I suspect not that much, but I think it is a good point that there are the implications of variations in that time, dry periods versus wet periods, and the implications for stream temperature of a changing or a dynamic sort of stream initiation threshold is actually really interesting, because you're just from an energetic standpoint, water that's flowing in the subsurface is going to be subject to different energy exchanges than water flowing in the surface. And the key thing, obviously, is that when water is flowing in the subsurface, when you're not talking about a rain event, the main thing is heat conduction through the soil, right? And that sort of dynamic. But when you get water that's flowing in the surface environment, you have all these sort of direct interfaces with the various surface energy fluxes that I highlighted. So that sort of shift through time, and if your water is predominantly, if your water that's being sourced from the landscape is predominantly spending it in the subsurface versus the surface network, and if that changes through time, I would expect there to be some sort of difference in the thermal regimes under those two scenarios. But I'm not sure if that many people have sort of looked into that, but it's a neat idea for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so we have to end this here. I know some students have classes starting at 2:30.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Jason. Very interesting talk. I hope that you will also present for our future seminars as well. We'll keep in touch. Thank you all for attending, and